Yo, what's up? So, I want to go over basically a little bit of information about indoor plants and the main problems that people get. Uh, so, the first thing I see, the first main problem I see with indoor plants is they're using soil, right? What's wrong with soil or potting mix? Uh, well, for starters, it holds a lot of water, which isn't always a bad thing, right? Because if you're outdoors, you want to hold a lot of water. It's going to dry quick outdoors because you've got the sun, right? And you got the wind and all the elements that are going to help dry the soil. But when you're inside, it's kind of a little bit more humid inside. It's a little bit less airflow. There's no sun. The light's not as strong. The soil generally is not going to dry as quick, right? So what happens is this plant will be sitting in a pot of soil. Even if it's good draining, even if the actual soil drains well, it's still going to just naturally stay very moist inside that pot. And usually the very bottom of the pot, like underneath, is going to be wetter than the top half. So what will happen is the top half will dry, the bottom half will stay really wet, and then you'll end up with this inconsistent moisture, right? So you're constantly going to be battling, okay, I need to water the plant because the top half's dry, but the bottom isn't drying out quick enough. And I mean, there is positives and negatives to using potting mix indoors, right? Okay, the main good thing about it is it contains fertilizer in the potting mix, and fertilizer is good because you need fertilizer, right? It's going to take out the effort of fertilizing your plant. The bad thing is, yeah, obviously, just because of how much water it actually holds and doesn't dry very quick. But also, soil is, what should I say? It's going to have a lot of bacteria. It could have fungus or fungi, and often it attracts a lot of bugs, right? So you get like fruit flies, you'll get fungus gnats and all sorts of things flying into the soil trying to like lay their eggs in the soil. So that is a problem. So what I would recommend is if you're growing indoors, to switch to cocoa or peat moss or something like that. The reason is like cocoa and peat moss hold way more water than soil, right? But they also drain quicker than they also drain and dry much quicker than soil. I'm not sure why. I think because they just wick up more water. So as it dries, it just wicks it up, wicks it up, wicks it up. And the bonus of this is like if the top half of the cocoa is drying out, it's more likely to wick up moisture from the bottom, and you're still going to have a more even moisture level, right? But cocoa on its own has no nutrients. There is a bonus to that though, is the pH is around 6.5. It's kind of like neutral-ish, 6.7, 6.5. But you're going to have to add nutrients to cocoa. You can treat it like hydroponic, use hydroponic nutrients, or what I just prefer to just tell people, get slow-release fertilizer, mix it in with the cocoa. Every time you water, you've got this slow-release fertilizer that's going to be fertilizing your plant for you. And the benefit of using cocoa is it's already sterile medium. It's already pretty clean. So you're not going to worry about getting bacteria, fungus infections, viruses, bugs, and all that. It's way less likely for that to happen. It's also less likely to overwater cocoa just because on a microscopic scale, if you're looking at it through a microscope, it actually holds water, actually holds air, like little air bubbles. I I think because it's like hair-like structures of the cocoa core, there's like little microscopic hairs that trap air bubbles. So even if you think you've overwatered it, it's probably going to be holding on to a lot of air as well, and that's going to stop like a lot of bacteria and fungus growing. Obviously, it's just going to be a lot harder to overwater these mediums, even though they do soak up more water. They actually dry quicker too. And another problem with soil is the pH of soil, right? It may have nutrients in it, but if your pH isn't at minimum 6.5, you've automatically got calcium locked out, right? You can have calcium in the soil and your plant's not going to be soaking this up because of the nutrient lockout. So you have to be careful of like the pH, but also different plants require different fertilizer, and that can be a problem because there's a lot of indoor plants that really don't like much fertilizer at all. And then some of them can be pretty hungry, so some of them might like it. And I would say the benefit of actually using cocoa is just because you're not going to overwater it, you're not going to run into as many problems and stuff. But if you do insist on using soil, then there is some tips you can do to kind of just minimize the risk of anything bad happening, right? So the first tip is use a water moisture meter, stick it in the soil, and it's going to tell you if your soil is dry or moist or whatnot. And they're not completely accurate. So you may like stick it in the pot, one side, it might give you a reading, another pot might give you another reading. It's either not accurate or you've got half the pot that's dry, half the pot that's actually not dry. So your soil is inconsistently watered. So you need to focus on getting an even watering. One way you can do that is with like a drip system, put a ring around your plant so it's watering the whole thing evenly at the same amount, same time. Or you can try maybe like a wicking system, like put it on a tray of water and it's all going to soak it up from the bottom. It doesn't really matter too much if you do water it inconsistently, because you can it's going to dry anyway. You're going to keep checking on your plant regularly, and you can water the dry areas. So the main thing is, if you get root rot in soil, like the bottom of the pot's too wet and you're starting to get root rot, the main things obviously you want to do with root rot is you want to take it out the soil. You want to get all of that old soil off, all the bad soil. Now you want to look at the roots, maybe even wash the roots, check it and see if you can trim any bad bits off. Like, it should be fine trimming the roots, especially if they're rotten anyway. They're already dead, the rotten parts. So you can trim the roots. You can repot the plant, which is obviously going to shock the plant, but it'll save your plant too. But if you don't want to do that, you can technically use hydrogen peroxide, which creates oxygen from hydrogen or something like that. Basically, whenever you use hydrogen peroxide, it's just going to help add some air back into that soil, and it's going to create a more aerated environment or aerobic environment, and it's going to help with a lot of that anaerobic bacteria and just kind of help bring the soil life into it. It's going to help with the health of the roots and everything. If you can't get hydrogen peroxide, I would suggest using fish tank water, right? And the benefit of using fish tank water is the fish tank water obviously has pH is already fixed. It's got water conditioner in it already, so because the fish need the water conditioner to survive because of the chlorine and all the bad chemicals. But the biggest benefit of fish tank water is the bacteria, right? It's got beneficial bacteria which obviously help clean up all the dead organic matter and just organic matter in general. It's going to control the nitrogen levels in the soil and everything. So the bacteria help clean that soil up and fix the nitrogen levels and all that kind of stuff, the nitrates. So fish tank water is probably the best thing you want to water with if you do start getting root rot or root problems, because the bacteria do all the work for you. But then, obviously root rot is not something you want to deal with. It kills a lot of plants. So you have to get that moisture sorted like instantly. Make sure you're not overwatering your plants. I would just not even use soil, honestly, indoors. I would just go cocoa with slow release fertilizer in it, and it's going to save you a lot of problems. But if you want, you can use a pH meter as well. Soil pH meter is going to check the pH. Use meters for everything. That's the only way to be sure, right? Water moisture meter. Use a light meter. Make sure you're getting enough light and sun. Maybe you're getting too much and you have to move the plant out of the light. You're also going to want your Npk test kit, your basic Npk. It's going to check your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. You may even want to check your TDS, your EC, your ppm. Basically, it's going to measure like the dissolved solids and salts and all that kind of stuff that are in your soil or the water that you're actually watering it with. And obviously, I would suggest if you're using tap water, stop using tap water. If you do use tap water, you can filter it, but you're better off also boiling the water. Boiling it's going to help get a lot of that chlorine and all the bad stuff out of the water just through like evaporation. Like obviously boiled water starts to vapor and it all comes out in the vapor, and like you let the water sit. Obviously you're not going to water your plant with boiling water because then you'll kill it. So obviously you have to let this boiling water cool down first. Once it's about whatever temperature your plant likes it at, like room temperature or something like that, you can give it to your plant basically like that. But I still prefer to just have some water, like boil a lot of water at once and then just have it sitting there. The longer it sits there, the more chlorine's going to come out of it. And you can add water conditioner to the water like they do in aquariums and stuff. Or you can use rainwater instead. Maybe you want to use rainwater. Rainwater is probably preferable for plants because that's what they would get in the wild. So I would suggest, check your water, your Npk, the light, maybe even the humidity, temperature. If it's too cold, a lot of plants don't do very well in the cold. But say, for example, maybe you are getting enough light, but there's not enough hours of light, okay? Because plants don't just need light, they need a certain amount of it. Flowering plants and non-flowering plants are a little bit different. Like usually flowering, they go by cycles where they vegetate and then they flower. And that's usually through a change of lighting. Like when it goes from cold season to hotter season, there is a change of light. And usually, depending on what plants it is, you're gonna have to check how much light it actually needs. I think something like 16 hours of light is like pretty good for indoor plants. When they're in the growing stage. I mean, if they're flowering, I think you want like 12 hours of light or something like that. So make sure they're getting enough light. They're not sitting in the shade all day because, I mean, some plants like the shade, right? Some plants don't need much light. They're pretty happy in low light. But there's no such thing as a plant that is no light at all, right? Every single plant needs light. So even shade-loving plants, they need some light. You can't just have them in shade where there's no light at all, right? It's still not going to do well. So there's some things you have to consider. check the moisture, check the pH, the NPK, TDS, ppm, EC, and whatever else you can. Check your roots regularly. You can look at the bottom of the pot. You can take the plant out the pot and have a look. You can, even if you think you've overwatered the plant too, you can kind of lift up the pot. You can stick your finger in there. You can just look at it, and it's going to give you a visual, what's the word? Idea of how dry the soil is by looking. But you can't trust your eyes, right? You can see the top of soil, and you can be like, "Oh, that looks dry." Now you look at the bottom. Oh, the bottom's wet. So that's where the moisture meter actually helps. Just to, I don't know, it's a bit more reliable than using your eyes. But then, yeah, what was I going to say next? Okay. So you've got your light and all that. Okay. So yeah, another thing you have to really be careful of is your bacteria and fungi, because a lot of indoor plants are really susceptible to bacterial infections, viruses, and fungi. The most common one is blight. Blight's going to affect so many indoor plants. I think it can be bacterial, but then you also got like fungal leaf spot and bacterial like leaf spot. So certain effects can have a bacterial version and a fungal version. Mosaic virus is going to affect a lot of indoor plants too, so really keep an eye out for like mosaic virus, leaf blight, leaf spot. And yeah, just if you're unsure of kind of like how to like diagnose what is wrong with your plant, the best way to diagnose what's wrong with your plant is you rule out all the other things first. You rule out your light, fertilizer, pH, water, all of that stuff. You rule it out. If everything's still not right and the plant's still not doing very well, and your roots are looking good, like your roots look healthy, it could be bacterial, viral, or fungal infection. And fungal infections are probably a little bit easier to treat because you can use hydrogen peroxide to kind of treat fungal infections. There is a bunch of fungicides you can use. Bacterial infections, you can use probiotics, like fish tank water do have the beneficial bacteria in the water. But you can buy a bunch of probiotics for plants as well. Just, I'm not going to name brands or anything because it depends what country you're in. Alright. I think compost is generally pretty good, mainly for outdoor plants. You want to use something like compost, which is going to add a lot of that beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria back into the soil. Because when you're dealing with like outdoor plants in soil, it's completely different than indoor plants. Outdoor plants seem to be a little bit more forgiving, just because you've got the natural soil biome. It's already there. It's already soil that's in the ground. Generally, is going to have all this bacteria, fungi, bugs, and stuff in it. That's going to just what's it called? Like a I think it's called a biome, like a microbiome in the soil. Like it's already got its own little system of how it works. So when you're indoors, indoor plant, you're trying to recreate an outdoor cycle, like a natural cycle, what happens outside. Obviously, it's pretty hard to recreate what's outside, but you can't also just take the outside techniques and apply them to indoors either. There is a little bit of a difference, like that. You're not very. No, I should say it's not a very good idea to use soil inside, right? Because I already explained why. And it's also not a very good idea to Oh no, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say pests. Indoor plants, you kind of want to try and avoid a lot of pests, right? Whereas outside, there might be natural predators and stuff that are going to eat a lot of pests. But when you're inside, though, you don't have all these predators that are going to prey on pests on your plant, like say like ladybug larvae, right? Ladybug larvae eat a lot of pests on your plant, and spiders, all sorts of animals outside are going to take care of that. I mean, you still do get problems with outdoor plants, but that is a benefit of using indoors as well. You can control the pests you get inside, um, but you can also control the lighting a bit better. You can control the temperature, the nutrients, all these specific things a little better. And you can also you can use sterile soil, which is probably the biggest one for me, is making sure that the soil or the potting mix or the cocoa or whatever is sterile before you even use it. Because a lot of people think that, oh no, the soil is sterile, it's no good to use because you need all these beneficial stuff in it, right? That is true, but it's not true as well. Because a lot of the times there's bad bacteria, bad fungi in the soil that you can bring into your indoor plants, and then they can infect other plants and all this stuff too. So what you can do is you can start with a sterile soil, and then you can add these beneficial stuff into it, like through fish tank water, through probiotics and all this stuff. Maybe inoculants for fungi. You can add all this stuff in after you know it's sterile to begin with, and then you've only got the beneficial stuff in there. There's no bad stuff in there. So really, I would recommend starting with sterile medium if you are growing inside, and then just adding all the beneficial stuff back into it. That's going to save you a lot of problems and definitely going to rule out a lot of infections, pests like nematodes, like thrips, and anything else that's kind of going to live in the soil and cause problems, right? Uh, so that is one thing. I mean, a benefit of outdoors is obviously worms. You've got worms outside that are going to bring a soil to life, and worms are always good. So maybe you want to use worm castings or something inside if you are growing indoors with soil. You can add worm castings. You can add compost to indoor plants, but same thing. It's the water problem. So like you might want to increase that aeration. You might want to increase the drainage. You might want to increase the light, the heat, just so it's all draining and drying, like kind of at the right time. That makes sense. So there's some things to consider with indoor plants. Like if you have any questions, just kind of like drop them in the comments below, and I should answer like what's wrong with your plant. Like obviously I can't identify everything what's wrong with your plant, especially bacterial fungal infections. Like I can just say, get yourself a little microscope, like one of those little microscopes you can use at home, and just start learning how to identify different bacteria and fungi. Um, as long as you know what bacteria and fungi look like, they look way different. So if you take one of these infected leaves off, put it under a microscope and just look at it. If you see bacteria, probably bacterial. If you see fungal, it's probably fungal infection. It could be powdery mildew, it could be downy mildew. So I mean, a microscope is going to save you there, but obviously you don't really need a microscope to identify powdery mildew, botrytis. You can definitely just see that with your eyes. It looks like powder on your leaves. But mites, okay, there is different types of mites. Some mites are microscopic and going to be a little bit harder to see with the eye. But then there are some mites which are a little bigger, like spider mites. You can technically see spider mites with the eye. And obviously the common symptom of spider mites is the webbing on the actual plants. But I think there is different mites you kind of want to watch out for, and they kind of like if you start seeing like all these deformed leaves and stuff with like maybe little I don't know, like looks like little bites on the leaves. Like you can tell something's been eating it, but you don't really know what it is. And it's probably mites or some other pests like that. Like it could be a caterpillar. I don't know how you're gonna get a caterpillar inside, but maybe it came. Maybe you put the plant outside for a day and then you bring it in, and then it somehow got on your plant from outside when you bring it in. So if you do have like indoor plants, try to avoid putting them outside and bring them in, because you can bring in unwanted pests and stuff from outside. So that's something you've got to watch out for. You may be like, oh, but my plant needs sun. I would, if you are going to put it outside, just kind of like don't put it on the ground. Like kind of put it somewhere where it's not touching the ground. It's less likely to get pests on it, and you could technically put it in front of a windowsill or something like that. Just be careful that the glass of the window doesn't magnify the sun and burn the leaves, because that is a problem that does happen. And yeah, just kind of like always keep an eye on your plants. Your plants will tell you what's wrong, and every single problem with your plant happens very slowly, right? It's never just an overnight thing that just happens, right? It'll always slowly tell you what's wrong, unless it's like over. If you underwater your plant, then obviously you might wake up one day, the leaf's going to be droopy. Then obviously you already know that you've underwatered it, because no other problems are going to happen that quickly, right? Like if you have nitrogen deficiency, it's not something that's just going to happen overnight. The leaves will slowly start yellowing, and you'll see it from the bottom to the top. It'll just start going yellow. So nutrient deficiencies and stuff like that happen slowly. Maybe if your leaf does get burnt, obviously that's going to happen quickly too, like sunburn, light burn, maybe even nutrient burn. Maybe you've got too much nutrients, or the pH is too hot or a little bit off. Then that can burn your plant pretty quickly. But obviously you can rule that out with a pH test, basically, or an Npk test. And there's pictures online, like little guides that'll help you kind of identify problems, especially nutrient deficiency charts that are very useful. And you can join forums, online forums. You can post pictures, and other people might be able to help you. But definitely rely on your basic meters a lot. Write down, keep a journal of everything you do with your plant. So write down in a little journal when you've watered it last, how much light it got, the temperature, and kind of try and monitor all this stuff, because especially your watering patterns, that's going to help a lot. Like trying to remember the last day you watered it. It's not really something people remember, right? You might just go check up on your plant and be like, when was the last time I watered this plant? And it kind of just takes a little bit of guesswork out of it. It's going to help you kind of just look at this chart and be like, oh, I fertilized this plant and now there's something wrong with it. So now you can be like, okay, the last thing I did was fertilize the plant. So maybe I over fertilized it. Maybe I burnt the plant. So definitely a journal will help you in that aspect, especially if you're doing like hydroponics or anything like that. They always keep a journal of all that stuff. There's a strict schedule with hydroponics where it's like every few days, every few weeks or something, it's got to get this much of this much of that, this much of this, and you've got to change your water all the time on certain days. So they are things that are going to help with your indoor plants. Okay, so keep that in mind. And yeah, also I'll just keep an eye out on these little yellow mushrooms that grow out the bottom of your pot too, because that often happens in soil. When you have mushroom spores already in the soil, these little mushrooms grow out the bottom, and that's because you've already had these spores in the soil, which is not uncommon. They often come in potting mix or compost, and I mean, spores are pretty strong. They can survive a pretty high temperature. Often they survive composting and all that. I'm pretty sure spores can even travel through space or something like that. I'm pretty sure I read a study they did where they tested if spores can survive the vacuum of space or something like that, and they could. So there's something to consider. if you have mushrooms growing in your pot, it's probably had the spores already in there to begin with, right? And that's one reason why you also want sterile medium like cocoa over soil or potting mix. All right, so I hope that helped, and yeah, just good luck with your plants and everything. So, peace.